So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about whose speech, corporate power as the missing link in the debate. Please join us here. Sasha, you can sit here. Great. So we want to talk about how both corporate and state power are reshaping freedom of expression in the digital era. And as we've now heard, a handful of global technology firms and their AI systems that are increasingly governing visibility, moderation, and reach. And so then the question is not simply what speech is free, but whose speech counts. And, we've talked about how this debate has been co-opted. So I want to jump into this really stellar panel here. So we've got David Kaye, who is a law professor at UC Irvine and the former special rapporteur on freedom of expression at the UN, who, years ago, you were one of the first people to really emphasize the role of corporate tech platforms and business and human rights as a freedom of expression issue. So I want to start with you to get a sense of, how did we get here? When did you start your special rapporteur role?
2014.
Okay, so we're a decade past that, and yet things are worse?
I mean, I don't want to claim responsibility for all of that. I mean, I do in a way, but I mean, a lot of people were involved in laying the groundwork for that. I guess, where I would want to start is how certain actors have kind of monopolized the idea of speech and what speech involves. And oftentimes I think it's framed as speech is about the speaker. It's about the person imparting information. And so you have all of these, what I think of as free speech phonies who only think about speech in the context of what one person can say, rather than thinking, like in a multi-dimensional way about everyone's access to information. So on this, I'm a total broken record on this. So if you've heard me talk about Article 19, not Barbara's organization, but the article in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other treaties, the right is, unlike the First Amendment, which simply says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or the press, it says that everyone enjoys the right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers. It's not just about the person who's imparting information. And so I think that when we think about seeking and receiving, we're also thinking about, browsing and access to pluralistic media and all of those things. And yet at least the ideological kind of monopoly has been solely with the imparting of information. And to that extent, we've had a real, I think, corporate capture in a way, but also political capture. And it goes to Jonathan Cantor's points about that kind of intersection of corporate and political power, but it's also corporate and political ideology about the nature of speech. So I kind of started there. I mean, for a while, the platforms at least went through the motions of adopting policies that understood that it's not just about the speaker, but it's about a rich environment for access to information. Doesn't seem, I mean, when it's completely self-regulatory, in the absence of enforcement of that, you end up where we are now.
And indeed, and we're lucky to have Alexandra Geese here, who has been a member of the European Parliament since 2019 for the Greens, and you are the digital expert for the Greens parliamentary group, and you helped negotiate the Digital Services Act, which is a response exactly as David said. You've also written that democracies tend to focus on a very 19th century idea of censorship. So talk to us a little bit more about that. How should we be thinking about this in a more robust way?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think we can think of it like in the Jackson Brown way, the Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, what they claim is they give you freedom of expression, but actually they own the place and decide whose opinion gets reach, gets visibility, gets heard. and who gets 2 likes and sits there in the corner. So I think this 19th century kind of idea that this bad censor with the big scissors or with a big black pen, just canceling, deleting it, that's the wrong idea. That is moderation, that's content moderation. The point is, you can simply make opinions invisible if you have an algorithm that makes sure it does not get seen. And this is what's happening across all platforms. Engagement-based ranking means that any kind of content that elicits fear and anger and outrage gets higher reach than anything else. And in terms of information, that means that any kind of, well-done Russian propaganda has higher reach than media content that abides by journalistic standards. It means that disinformation reaches more people than information. And in political terms, it means that extremist content, particularly far-right content, gets a lot more visibility than any other kind of content, of political content. And I don't think that is freedom of speech. It's not the freedom to have access to information, to a variety of information, which is something we have also enshrined in the German Constitution. And it's not the freedom to have my opinion be seen by people. And it's not people's freedom to choose, because we don't choose the content we see. This is the mistake a lot of people see. We think we choose our timelines. No, we don't. We engage with content, and then the platform decides what we get on that base. And they say that's an act of choice. But it's sort of like, if I get mocked or robbed in the street and I defend myself, I do interact, absolutely, that's interaction. But is that my choice? I don't think so. I think we need to go back to content that people really choose and adjust the algorithms accordingly. And that's something we could do with the DSA if we had the courage.
Yes, courage. I mean, that is one of the challenges, I think, in this debate, right, is to stand up to some of these very powerful corporate actors. I want to turn now to Sasha Havlicek, who is the co-founder and CEO of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. And, this issue that you've talked about, the invisible hand of distribution, the role that is playing in cultivating and fostering extremism. A few years ago, we were talking about the role in promoting terrorism, et cetera. We serve on the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism. So we know these platforms have incredible power over what we see, when we see it, the groups that get formed. What are you seeing in terms of the power of these corporations over speech and association?
Thanks, Courtney. And yes, I'll start maybe with our journey in this space, because my organization, ISD, has been detecting, analyzing, trying to prevent threats to individual rights, to public safety, to national security, to democratic processes, integrity, emanating from a host of bad actors. And that includes terrorists, violent extremists. It includes hostile state actors. We do a lot of work to understand the kinds of psychological and information operations of Iran and the CCP and the Kremlin, these sorts of problems. And what we found over time was that not only were platforms sort of systematically failing to enforce their own rules, the kind of promise that they make to users in their terms of service about what what people will and won't encounter on their platforms. But in addition to that, we found something really strange, because in the context of these nasty things happening, because we're free speech advocates, we believed that the best way, of course, to deal with nasty stuff is more speech, alternative speech. And we tried with many, many, many partners to do that, to flood the internet with counter speech initiatives of different kinds. And over time, again, as we evaluated all of this, we realized they weren't breaking through. In fact, they were never going to break through. And this is where our analysis started to look at the kind of systemic problems that many of you have been talking about. And what we found was that, again, the content that comes closest to the red line of terms of service of the platforms is in fact the most viral. It's not a level playing field for speech. It's a tilted playing field in the interest of not one political view or another, but the more and more extreme variants of whatever political view, whatever issue area you might be interested in. And in fact, it's a kind of slippery slope into very fragmented and enclosed environments where, again, the most sensationalist, the most extreme variants of ideas essentially outcompete whatever comes, more close to, if you like, the middle ground. And what that's meant, this kind of funhouse mirror that the social media landscape is now of us, is that, again, the most divisive, the most anger-filled kinds of voices outcompete. And, if you have the 20% on any kind of ideational extreme winning out systematically over whatever it is in the middle, the 80% of the sensible, you're starting to create a totally distorted environment. And part of that has resulted in really terrifying things. We see a massive trend in radicalization and recruitment of younger and younger people, of course, kids getting served up content that they were not initially looking for, but they were driven to it through these algorithmic patterns. And so I think this is the piece, the responsibility in our minds really lay here in the serving up of things that you were not otherwise going to be encountering.
And, we talk about the political will, but now we're in an era where you have this increasing polarization, increasing extremism, far right, kind of the creation of communities of conspiracy theorists across a bunch of different issues, right? And Alexandra, you mentioned the lack of political will. It seems to me that we're also seeing the free speech debate and pro-democracy narratives co-opted by pro-authoritarian actors. Given this dynamic, I mean, what is the potential for political will? You heard me talk about all the threats from the US against Europe. What's going to happen here?
Well, that is an interesting question. I think it's two distinct questions. I think on the one hand, we have the threats of the US against Europe, and I think the Commission is taking them very seriously, especially the terror threats, but also the threat not to support Ukraine. So I think those are the two big issues at stake here. I think sometimes Europe doesn't realize how important the Digital Services Act is, and we need President Trump to attack it so strongly to realize what a wonderful instrument that could be. That's a little bit the paradox of European policy and politics, I believe. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is the free speech debate that I think will, right now, is a little bit in elite circles in Europe. But I think it is growing, it's becoming bigger. I keep seeing articles. The US is pushing it a lot through Nigel Farage, for example, in UK, through the far right in Germany. And this is why I think we need a counter movement. I mean, we can't leave the idea of freedom of speech in the hands of an authoritarian power. Of people who made sure that 145 people in the US lost their jobs just because they made comments or quoted Charlie Kirk's words on social media. And the same person, J.D. Vance, who asked for that, who publicly said, well, talk to their employers, is the one coming to Europe and saying we have issues around freedom of speech. That is ridiculous. So I think we need to retake that question in our hands and say, no, we are the ones fighting for democracy. We are the ones fighting for freedom and for freedom of expression. And we should reframe it offensively and not in a defensive way. So far we've been saying, well, but the DSA doesn't do anything around freedom of speech. On the contrary, it protects freedom of speech, which is all correct. But once in politics you're on the defensive, you lose, especially in a polarized environment where with that kind of arguments, nobody sees them. That's the problem. So I think the points are, one, this kind of algorithm engagement-based ranking is a breach of freedom of speech, is threatening freedom of speech as such, because everybody who doesn't want to go for hateful, violent, and extremist content has his visibility suppressed in the internet, first point. So I think this is something we should attack as an attack on freedom of speech. Second point, there are basically manual interventions in the algorithm. I mean, you saw the numbers probably of Elon Musk's account after he joined the Trump campaign, and they went like that. And we have numbers from the German electoral, the federal elections in February, where we see that the far right is basically tripled. One far left party that was pro-Putin multiplied by 10 times. The Greens and the Social Democrats, so the moderate progressive, reduced to a 12th and a 5th of their content. That's suppression of speech, very, very clearly. So that's a second point. And if I may, a third point, I think, is the fact that people who get attacked with hate, with lies in the internet, they leave public discourse. They leave social media, the targets of all that hate that goes under freedom of speech in the right-wing authoritarian kind of version. They leave public discourse. They leave politics. I mean, in Germany, we have, in many places, we have trouble to recruit people who want to run in local elections because of the hate they get. Hundreds of death threats. Their kids get threatened in schools. People find dead animals in the house on their door. That is suppressing freedom of speech in a way that is unprecedented in my country right now. And that is something we also need to call out.
Yes, I think we're seeing the same thing in the US. David, I want you to comment on this.
So first off, I totally agree, Alexandra, with the point that we need an offense. We need a strategy that's not just responding to sort of the idea that we're hearing from the authoritarians, kind of capturing the idea of speech. Totally agree with that. I just want to complicate things a little bit more, just in the sense that, we're talking about platforms. In a sense, we're talking, yes, about today's problem, but it's also a little bit of yesterday's problem as well. And, we're seeing repeated kind of this, again, this corporate and political overlap in the context of AI, in the development of AI tools, where, clearly government is now like the cheerleaders for OpenAI and the others in the AI industry. And they're doing so in a way that is not reflective, not even considering really the kind of risk assessment, again, that the DSA requires of platforms, but the kind of risk assessment that you should be doing before launching these tools into the wild. And so there's that problem. And you also have the problem of mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. So, and European governments, in addition to others, not really putting the brakes on that. But that also has a very strong kind of authoritarian and corporate element to it. And I think we need to be sort of seeing the entire information environment is influenced not just by, these monopolistic platforms, but also by, corporate surveillance companies, the private surveillance industry, and this like seemingly can do no wrong AI industry that's really dominant.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that is the key part of the question is, part of what we're facing is an emerging crisis of how we know what we know, because part of the way that you've done your research and you make policy is that, you rely on the knowledge that you can get. Inadequate as it is from the data access from platforms, it is even more opaque in AI, in chatbots. It's personalized. There are no fiduciary responsibilities. How are you thinking about doing the work that you've done, which has relied on being able to see these information flows, which are now even more privatized? What are you thinking about?
Yeah, there's no question that, of course, generative AI has become a tool in the toolkit of authoritarian state information and cyber operations, for instance. Of late, we've seen that deployed quite skillfully and upgrade, if you like, the impact of these types of information operations of late. And so, again, it's, bad actors are always early adopters of emerging technologies. The bottom line is, and it's becoming harder and harder, as you rightly said, to detect and to analyze these kinds of operations, not least because we're seeing a shuttering by corporations of access to data, access for third-party independent research organizations to the kind of data that would enable better detection of these kinds of threats, including, by the way, systemic harassment and intimidation and threats, abuse of the kind that Alexandra, you talked about, that we've certainly monitored a great deal, but also the kind of data that we need in order to be able to evaluate the extent to which, as I've called it, the sort of invisible hand behind the scenes, the algorithmic systems might in fact be distorting the speech ecosystem in ways that we've talked about. That's going to be vital, even more important now as we see generative AI come on board. And I will just say there is no such thing as perfect regulation. I will admit to that. I
What?
think, really, and we mustn't be evangelist, I think, about one piece of regulation over another and so on. But there are some very fundamental principles we should all be adhering to if we're interested in liberal democracy, where authoritarian states, in seeing these kinds of problems, that we work on platforms, respond with control and with censorship. We have to do the exact diametric opposite, which is essentially mandated transparency. And to some extent, that's where we've gotten to with Article 40 of the DSA, is this sort of mandated transparency principle, which enables us not just to evaluate whether the rules are being upheld by platforms, but also to evaluate whether there has in fact been overreach in platform moderation. We can use this transparency to see clearly, are we seeing shadow banning at scale? Are we over-moderating content in ways that are really fundamentally problematic? That is the way we can hold everybody to account at the same time.
I mean, yes, sure. But to some extent, that is a downstream problem, right? And it assumes that you can get the information. And I think we're still unclear on how that's going to apply in AI. So I'm not saying we don't need transparency, but I want to go to David because, we've worked together for almost 20 years, probably promoting human rights and using this rights framework. And it seems to me that a huge missing element of the free speech, the free expression, privacy debates is market power, right? We're talking so much about, did my piece of content get taken down and can I have this, can I adjudicate this and take months, to figure out if it gets put back? But, not to put you on the spot, but, when we're looking at the corporate power over speech, I don't remember us ever talking about market power. I don't remember us ever talking about just how much of the information ecosystem, the market power that these companies have. If you were special rapporteur today, do you think that would be higher up on the list?
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, a panelist for putting people on the spot. So it's all good. I mean, I think, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a little bit of analysis, self-criticism that we can all engage in on this. And, in 2014, 2015, when I was thinking about this as special rapporteur, clearly, I mean, the focus was on company rules. And, we were looking at platforms that were essentially lawless. Maybe they still are today, but the focus was therefore on content moderation, the process of content moderation, the rules, the who decides kinds of questions. But I think concentration of power also was behind some of that. And particularly if you go back and look at, I mean, certainly the work of my predecessors focusing on the concentration in media more generally, that has long been kind of a core concern of the freedom of expression, right? That in the absence of pluralistic media, which is, basically the existence of concentrated media, then you're going to have limited access to information, a lot of gatekeeping by players that have interests that aren't in the public interest. Some of the work that I did and that you've done, even, 10 years ago, highlighted the fact that platforms weren't operating on the basis of public interest, right? They were operating on the basis of basically of private interest and the advertising models that they sustain. So, I mean, that's just a long way of maybe in part avoiding the question. But I think, you're absolutely right. And that move, maybe even going back 6 or 7 years, I remember that Ranking Digital Rights did a report on the business model And they were very much focused on not just the model and the advertising, but also on the concentration. So I think there was a move to that, but clearly, articulating the connection between concentration and pluralistic media is something we need to work more on. And certainly today we need to.
And Alexandra, I mean, the EU has brought competition cases. You have the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act. So there are a panoply of legal regulatory tools, and yet it seems that these platforms are more powerful than ever. And you still see, European governments are on X despite not liking its content moderation policies. They're signing contracts with cloud service providers that are American companies. So, again, like part of it is political will, but like what are the options? How does Europe move forward? Does it have the tools it needs?
Well, I think Europe has the tools, but as we said several times, what is lacking is really the political will. And I think in part it is fear of the US simply. It is fear of these companies. I mean, it is market power, and the market power is simply huge. And we have a huge dependency on US services and products in the digital area, on the infrastructure. I think partly it is also this belief that Europe cannot exist without the transatlantic relationship. And we still want to be friends, and everybody, we do want to be friends, but the problem is that the current US government does not want to be friends with Europe. And I think that is something that we need to acknowledge. And how to bring that about is very difficult. But I think for this, it is very important what we are doing today to have Americans calling this government out, to have Americans saying, this is not against American companies. This is action to preserve freedom and democracy and to fight against monopolies. I think that is a way forward, to have a very close cooperation with that part of the society that also wants to preserve democracy and fight this kind of monopolistic power. But I also think a little bit, if I may, to go back to the question that you asked, David, when I entered that space in 2018-19, basically, I was quite surprised that when I talked in Germany to normal people, to voters, they were very concerned about hate. The kind of hateful speech in the internet and people being attacked and being thrown out of public discourse. And when I joined sort of the expert conversation around this, it was all around content moderation and freedom of speech of the speaker, of the hater. And it was really two completely distinct things. And I think that is a little bit one of the reasons why we don't have enough public support, because it's still a very technical conversation. And that's obviously the corporations wanted to make it so, saying, well, AI is a black box and it's all very technical and you don't understand anyway, just trust us. But I think it's also our fault that we live in this sort of bubble where we know what we're talking about, but we don't make the effort to translate that. And this is, I think we would have needed a paradigm shift a little earlier, because I think all the experts were concerned about power of or censorship by state entities. But private companies, that they could become the actors or the censors, that was not something that people really had on their mind, or it refused to discuss that. So I think that was a paradigm shift that came a little bit too late. And this is why I insist so much on this paradigm shift on freedom of speech. I think that is important. And also to explain it to normal people, to really get public opinion. Because if you talk about hate, if you talk about disinformation, that's what people do care about, absolutely. If you word it in terms of mass surveillance, it's a lot more difficult and works in some countries like mine, but not in others. So finding a language that you really explain why it matters to people. It's like competition. I say, well, this is about prices going up. Then people understand. And this is something we should do also. And I think that's a way forward in Europe.
You wanted to mention something, David? In response?
No, there's so much here. I mean, I do think that, first off, I'm just 100% aligned with this framing issue and the way you're arguing this, Alexandra. I think that we're in a moment where we rely so much right now on Europe doing the right thing on these things. I don't know if it's right to say to get its act together, but to actually enforce the laws that have been adopted, because I think there's a lot of concern that, and again, it's the political will that you're describing, that Europe will kind of hesitate at the edge of this and not do what's required. But that, right now, we do have an authoritarian-minded and authoritarian US government that, is pushing to undermine entirely, basically pushing to repeal DSA, DMA, and anything else that might implicate American companies. And so
it's really concerning to me because, we're talking about how important Europe is, the need for political will. I was just at a trade, an EU tech trade. They opened some new office in Washington, and the EU ambassador to Washington got up and was talking and said, we support big tech. Oh, sorry. No, she said, we love big tech and we will always love big tech. So this is the message we're hearing in Washington, right? Even as we are, I think, increasingly recognizing the challenge and power of big tech over freedom of speech. And, you heard Max and myself talk about, all of the examples of the manipulation, of the, efforts to distort and leverage these platforms. And Sasha, with the issues that you're working on, how are we, what do you see happening with the rise of extremism, the rise of far-right, illiberal forces that have no interest in democracy, but they leverage the arguments of democracy to defend their right to undermine it?
So in the first place, I think it's really important that we remember that bad actors are playing this across the political aisle. And the objective is division. And they're stoking of both hard left, far right, and all forms of extremist ideology in that online space. This isn't just falling on one side of the aisle. And so this should be a concern for all of us. In the same way that systemic bias online, we've seen complaints about that both from the left and from the right. And indeed, we should be concerned. Right now, nobody has any idea about whether the systems are in fact systemically biased in one direction or another. Why? Because we have not had access to the kind of data to be able to evaluate those algorithmic systems in that way until now. And we do now have an instrument that should get us there. We're not quite there yet. And yes, we need the political will to carry this through. But we should now have the ability to both evaluate that and make sure that the public understands and that we're able to correct systemic bias, the tilting of the level playing field of the information space. We all should be looking for genuine solutions to creating a free market of ideas, a free market of ideas. And that's why I think the rhetoric can't be just bashing corporations or not. This is about making sure that we're in an environment that enables the proper functioning of a market, of a free market, the proper functioning of a free market of ideas. We all want free speech to ultimately flourish. What we understand now, sadly, over time and through all of our collective analysis and research, is that the social media platforms are not free speech environments. And that is the thing that we need to fight to rectify.
And, oftentimes we have regulated our communications infrastructure according to a public interest oriented set of laws, right? As similar to akin to, public utilities or imposing, must carry provisions on broadcast or satellite media, streaming. I think it's now here in Europe has a requirement, or we've required them to be, neutral intermediaries and prevented discrimination, required fair carriage, prevented self-preferencing. And yet, I feel like we never talk about that as potential solutions. We are talking about transparency. We talk about, getting due process. But should we be thinking and using a broader set of tools, thinking about these platforms, social media platforms, AI, chatbot platforms as kind of critical communications infrastructure? Alexandra?
Yes, we should, definitely. But I would agree with Sasha on the role of total transparency. I think that would be super important, but that also, it's a question of political will. It's not a problem of intellectual insight into what it should look like. But in the DSA, we had an incredible fight around Article 40 on the data access. You know, because the more conservative parts said, and also the liberals in the European sense, you know, centrist liberals said, well, if we give data access to data of private companies, that sets a precedent. What then about automotive companies? What about pharmaceutical companies? There was a big fight against that kind of transparency along political lines. That's a political reality. I think we come up with the right ideas, but then put them into practice in a political environment is a lot more difficult. And then the other thing that goes with market power is the lobbying power of these companies that needs to be addressed.
But even if you have transparency, it's like, great. You're transparently promoting, one political side. Like that still seems to be insufficient. And like we need a bigger set of policies. Is that even a possibility here in Europe?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in the Digital Services Act, we have Article 34 that defines systemic risks. And there is, for example, the systemic risk to public discourse and electoral processes. In Romania, we had to repeat a presidential election because Russian, or we don't know exactly because the Commission doesn't publish the results of the investigation, but some kind of massive political interference that was completely contrary to Romanian electoral law. That is systemic risk to electoral processes. It is the fact that from the German elections, we have the numbers on how some parties were suppressed and others were boosted. That is systemic risk to public discourse and electoral processes. The fact that it's a lot easier to find disinformation in your timeline than information, that is a risk to media freedom and the freedom of information. Absolutely. This is what I'm saying. We have that. I mean, at last, sorry, I got up 4:30 this morning, and I'm not a morning person. At least for social media, we have that instrument, we have that article. So we get the transparency now, and the Commission has the possibility to open an investigation on all these aspects today. And Article 34.5 says mitigating measures, and they specifically list the algorithms, for example, the business model, so the advertising model, the surveillance, the use of data, all this is as specifically listed. The Commission could just do that. The problem is that they lack the political will. There is no will to do that. They focus on issues where they think there might be similar thinking in the US, for example, minors, for example, the Google ad case, because it started in the US, but it's staying away from the things that could really save our democracy from going down the path that is going down in the US. And for me, this is very frustrating. And therefore, I don't think we have all the time for an intellectual discussion on how this should look like in 10 years right now. I think what we need now, and I mean, I'm the politician in the room, I acknowledge that, but we really need a push to get this done. And we need this help also from the American side to go and tell the Commission, if you want to keep your democracy and you want to keep democratic parties in power, don't listen to Trump, get this done.
And I mean, that is why we're here. Yes.
Right. And these are rules for Europeans, for Europe. These are not rules that apply to the rest of the world. Right. And so to Jonathan's point, we've just got to start to do this thing and get this in motion and then evaluate how well it's working or not. I think the proof will be in the pudding. To the point that you were making earlier, I think generally the public feels something really needs to be done, whether it's parents feeling completely desperate to get control somehow of what's happening to their kids in so many different directions. I mean, the kind of serving up to the most vulnerable users of stuff that will get them addicted and or drive them down a really dangerous pathway, whether it's self-harm or extremist violence, whether it's people who realize that in some shape or another, they are closer to each other than the internet on all the most divisive political issues than the internet would have them believe. And we see this over and over again in the polls. People want to see something done about this, and we need to be able to give them solutions. We've got something of a pathway. We've got to try it in Europe. There has to be a different set of conversations about how we protect public safety, national security, our kids, in the digital era in other parts of the world. And we have to have a genuine conversation about how we do that in a free speech, in a speech protective manner.
And we are going to spend the rest of the day speaking about some of those solutions. And the whole reason we are here doing this event on the future of democracy in Brussels is because we want to help create that political will, foster that political will. And so with that, I would like to thank our amazing panelists for a great discussion.